Look, intersectionality is a useful heuristic in a way. It's a useful way of saying, yes, it can be that if you're both Black and a woman, you may face more discrimination than if you were just Black or just a woman. And I can, as you said, I can get with that as well. I don't think any of those things are always true. And it's a sometimes or a mostly that turns into an always that becomes an ideology. So it's a heuristic that's turned into an axiom. And I think that's when it becomes dangerous.
Join us for Straight Ahead, the Omni-American podcast. Welcome to Straight Ahead, the Omni-American podcast. What would a vigorous conversation among people from a strong cultural and political center look like and sound like? Our conversation with David Bernstein today answers this question. We discuss intersectionality, systemic racism, are Jews white, DEI, post-colonialism, the impact of the October 7th attack of Hamas against Israel on Jewish Americans, and as always, the meaning and value of being an Omni-American.
Our conversation with David is especially relevant in light of recent protests on American campuses. And in this context, we can make 2 points. A, there are Islamists and hardcore members of the post-colonial left among the protesters. And Democrats and Republicans who belong to that broad center that you referred to, Greg, they need to understand and internalize, if they haven't done so already, that these people see them as enemies. They're very clear about that. The second point, however, is we don't need to moan and bewail that fact. We need to accept it in the spirit of what Albert Murray called antagonistic cooperation. Through this challenge, we have the opportunity to go deeper into ourselves and to come out stronger, and in so doing, say yes to all of life.
David Bernstein, our guest for today. Welcome to the show.
Great to be with you guys.
All right. Well, I tell you, our paths have crossed on the last few years on many occasions. We've been in Israel together. We both spoke at the Birthright Excel conference in 2023 in New York City. I attended an event of yours called New Alliances. So why don't we start there? What was or is New Alliances? And then let's then get a little more about your background, your institutional and personal and professional background.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful to be with you guys. So I've been in the Jewish advocacy world my entire career. And for much of that time, I've been doing intergroup relations work. Black Jewish alliances, Latino Jewish alliances, Asian American Jewish alliances, Christian Jewish, Muslim Jewish, you name it. And most of that time, it's been primarily, but not exclusively, with politically progressive organizations representing those communities, NAACP and the like. And in 2021, I sort of broke off on my own. I know I'm going to my background first, but it helps explain why we're doing what we're doing now.
Sure.
I broke off because I felt that the entire space that I had been part of most of my career had really become very ideological. It had embraced, what you might call critical social justice ideology by and large, and that it became harder and harder to talk about issues openly, and that there was now a price of admission into progressive politics and advocacy that there wasn't before. It wasn't enough that you might want to fix the criminal justice system. You now had to say that America was a white supremacist state in order to even be at the table. And that was too steep of a price for me to pay. And I became deeply disenchanted with it and moved off and started an organization called the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values that was meant to restore sanity, I would argue, or certainly liberalism and openness into the conversation, both in the Jewish community and in the external world. But for me, it wasn't enough just to engage the Jewish community on these issues. I always knew that I wanted to continue to be involved in the broader community, to engage other ethnic and religious communities, and to make common cause with them. And to me, the cause had shifted from what you might have described once as the social justice agenda or the civil rights agenda, to sort of the liberalism agenda, to the democracy agenda, to the Omni-American agenda, if you will. And so one of the first acts in this new organization was to bring together a group of prominent Black, Asian, Jewish, Latino intellectuals, thought leaders, activists, to start discussing what our common work was and trying to rebuild an American center, to articulate a robust American patriotism or an Omni-American ideal in a way. And that's why I got to meet you guys and other fantastic people. Now, that group originally was called New Alliances, and we had trouble getting some of the philanthropic support that we had hoped. And what I realized was that we needed to make it around a particular set of issues if we were going to get off the ground. So our first act is really K through 12 education, ethnic studies, radicalism in education, and that's how we're sort of mobilizing some of the same people who were involved before.
Okay, thank you for that succinct answer. Now, you mentioned about your institutional background, not only with various ethnicities, but focusing on in the Jewish world. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so there's a field within the larger Jewish community, often called community relations, or community relations and advocacy. For many years, I worked for local Jewish community relations councils in the beginning. I was director of the regional office of a group called the American Jewish Committee, which is one of the long-time vaunted Jewish institutions, been around for more than 100 years. I eventually oversaw regional offices for that organization and did national level programming. I did Israel education and advocacy training. I ran an organization called the David Project, but I trained students, Jewish students, to reach out to their counterparts in other ethnic and religious communities and to do what I called relational advocacy work at that time. And in the last 5 years before I sort of broke off, I was president and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, which is the umbrella of all the local Jewish community relations councils around the United States. So I had been deep in. Now, I've always been a moderate, and I've always felt a bit out of sync with some of my more progressive, counterparts in the community. And I always sought to steer the Jewish advocacy world in the direction of moderation and centrism and so forth, knowing that I might not always agree with even every policy that my organization undertook. But I generally felt comfortable in that space, but that became much less so, certainly in the wake of George Floyd, but probably really from the get-go of taking on that job at the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. I realized that I was sort of swimming upstream at that point in 2016.
Okay.
So what I'm interested to know, when you're in this advocacy work, the process by which you saw the change taking place. So you mentioned in your book, Woke Anti-Semitism, that you really started to think differently about things after the Durban conference in 2001.
Yes.
So maybe you can say a few words about why you consider that event, that I don't know, is it called a conference? What do we call it? That conference, why was it so important, and how did it change your thinking?
Yeah. So one thing that happened before the Durban conference was in the late 1990s, I participated in a multicultural day event through something called Leadership Washington. And I was excited about it. I did intercultural relations, so why wouldn't I be? I was a young staffer, at that point, and to me, this was a great opportunity. And the facilitator got up, and the first thing out of his mouth was, racism equals prejudice plus power. And I thought to myself, wait a second, I thought racism was animus toward another racial group. Where did this come from? And so I started thinking about it and exploring it more. And it really struck me that if that's your definition of racism, it meant that Jews who were perceived as a powerful group really had no standing and couldn't be victims, and and that groups that were perceived as powerless couldn't be perpetrators. And I thought that was dangerous for the Jewish community. I think I wrote my first article about it in 2023, 21 years ago, really citing this as a problem.
Did you mean 2003?
I'm sorry, 2003. Yes, okay. 2003. I'm sorry. Yes.
That's okay.
And then not long after that moment in 1999 was the Durban conference. I think it was in the fall of 2000. And
In one.
yeah, 2001. I'm sorry. Yes, it was right after 9/11. A couple months after 9/11, you had this international gathering of activists who were supposedly coming together to fight racism, and yet Jews were targeted in a very vicious way at that conference.
Maybe set the stage a bit. This is South Africa, 2001, a conference, people from all around the world associated with social justice movements, seemingly progressive movements, post-colonial movements, come together in Durban.
Yes, they did. And I think for a lot of Jews, this was a tremendous wake-up call, much the same way that October 7th was a wake-up call for them, because they realized something had changed after the peace process. The Camp David peace process had collapsed a year before. There was a second intifada that Yasser Arafat unleashed, and all of a sudden, many of the sort of ideological issues and the campus fights and the culture wars were suddenly back upon us. It was sort of our wake-up call after this respite from history that we enjoyed like during the 1990s up until the early 2000s. We had all thought that we had reached the end of history, to quote Francis Fukuyama, and that, you know, liberalism had prevailed. And this was a sign for many Jews and probably many others that liberalism had not, in fact, prevailed, that there were these forces of history were still very much upon us. And Durban was for me a wake-up call. And I realized, okay, we're still fighting these old battles that I thought we had left behind us. And so I always had an eye on that. My first day on the job in 2016, when I started at the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, I had published an op-ed on intersectionality. Now, that was a word that no one in the Jewish world, unless you were an academic in the humanities or social sciences, had ever heard of. And it caused a complete and utter firestorm. I think there were 8 op-eds written in reply. You know, this is like the first week or two of the job, condemning my op-ed on intersectionality from various progressive Jewish voices. And I was warning the Jewish community that people were connecting causes, so that people were connecting what was the early phases of the Black Lives Matter cause and the Palestinian solidarity movement and the sex violence groups and the gay rights groups were all starting to join forces and see Israel and Jews as part of an oppressor class. And I said that we have to push back against that. And I made the argument that we had to, or else we were going to find ourselves fundamentally out of sync with progressive movements. And I think, you know, I don't take any satisfaction to say that I think I had it right then.
I hear. Greg, I'm sure you have questions for David, but I have one particular question. David, I know your mother's side of the family comes from Iraq. I'm watching you wind that it looks like you're holding a bunch of prayer beads in your hand there.
I watched my grandmother who came from Baghdad, Iraq when I was a little kid and moved in with us. And she sat on the same couch most hours of the day. And she had a set of beads and she would go like this all day long, as many people from the Arab world do. Maybe that rubbed off on me, and maybe that I still have, maybe it's in the genetics. I don't know.
I tell you, probably in the culture. It's so interesting. Your family's originally from Iraq. Another of our guests this season, Roya Hakakian.
Know that name?
Yeah, she's a great writer from Iraq.
From the neighbor Iran, from the neighbor of Iraq.
Thank you for that correction. Yeah. From the neighbor of Iraq. But to me, one of the things that just that little Iran-Iraq Jewish connection points to is the deep diversity of the Jewish people and Jewish life. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. Intersectionality, something that I first studied and heard about during graduate school in the 90s.
Yeah, me too.
And if you look at it in a very general way, because you can apply intersectionality in different ways.
Yes.
If you apply it in the oppression Olympics way, you can say that, if you have this combination of characteristics, gender, class, race, then you're more likely to be victimized or a victim, or you are a victim.
Yes.
Okay. But you could also look at intersectionality if you were to make it more general and more universal, that you have a combination of traits that will tend towards being of benefit to you or not benefit in a particular social and cultural setting in a particular place and time.
Yes.
Now, if that were the definition, I think most people could get with it because that's just kind of like reality. But what happens is these ideological lenses and these strong ideological forces end up, taking ideas and using it for the sake of status and power.
I want to hit your intersectionality point for a moment, though, because I think it is so spot on. Look, intersectionality is a useful heuristic in a way. It's a useful way of saying, yes, it can be that if you're both Black and a woman, you may face more discrimination than if you were just Black or just a woman. And I can, as you said, I can get with that as well. I don't think any of those things are always true. And it's a sometimes or a mostly that turns into an always that becomes an ideology. So it's a heuristic that's turned into an axiom. And I think that's when it becomes dangerous. And that, again, I think that there's aspects of the social justice, critical social justice discourse that makes sense, that probably I've even adopted at part of my own as a lens myself. Do I think that there's systemic oppression in the world? Absolutely. Do I think that's a useful way of understanding it at times? Absolutely. Do I think it always explains every disparity? No, I think it's more complicated than that. And that's why I push back against it, because people are selling it in that way. I think Jonathan Haidt once said that critical race theory is cuckoo, and he said, by that I don't mean crazy. I mean like the cuckoo bird. It's pushing the other bird's eggs out of the nest. It's crowding out the other ideas that might need to be discussed and debated and understood.
Can you expand on something there? Can you give a 2-minute argument why you think systemic racism is real? Yeah.
I think, Greg, I might have even showed you an advanced copy. I wrote a very extensive piece in Free Black Thought called In Search of Systemic Racism. And I looked at 7 different manifestations of what people call systemic racism. And I think some of it is probably true. I don't believe America is systemically racist, but I believe that there's still pockets of systemic racism in America. It could be in a particular police force where there's a very pervasive culture, let's say, of racism that is reinforced and acted out by a particular police force or particular precinct even. It might not be the entire police force. It could be in a particular precinct that they have that culture.
In fact, just one quick second. In fact, I just saw on Twitter the other day, someone put up a link about an officer, a current officer, I don't know if he's still in the force, who had 400 cases where he had basically screwed up evidence in order to implicate and have Black American or people who are racialized as Black defendants be charged. And so, there are instances like that. So that's an actual example.
Yeah. Look, I think there are other examples, whether you call them systemic racism or something else, implicit bias, or, is worth exploring, I guess. I remember Glenn Lowry cited a very fascinating example, African-American economist, brilliant man.
Oh, he's been a guest on our show, man.
I'm sure he has been. He's the best. And I've seen you on his show. So Glenn said, I don't think that what we're seeing in the criminal justice reforms, the criminal justice space is itself systemic racism, because I think that there was a rise in crime in the 1990s, 80s, and 90s that made people think that we needed a fix. He goes, but I do have some questions, and I'm paraphrasing him, about the fact that so many Americans were allowing so many Black men to be incarcerated on low-level drug crimes for so long without any action. He said, that seems to me that might be a kind of deep-seated implicit bias. Is that systemic racism?
Okay.
Maybe, maybe not. I think you could argue it either way. I think there are other things that I could cite to, and I'd invite anybody to read my piece.
It's a question of the words we use, the definition of the words we use. So it comes down to that often. But one of the things that I talked about in my conversation with Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter when I was a guest on Glenn's show for the second time was an instance that is clearly bias, whether you call it racism, is bias. And it ties to, and I didn't make this point at the time, Roland Fryer's great economist at Harvard, his research that showed that while it's not the case, and I hope I'm stating it correctly, that Black people or people who were racialized as Black were killed more often by the cops or at a higher percentage, what was found is that in terms of how they were treated, how they were manhandled and that kind of thing, that there was clear bias in that, which then ties to the point I did make on that show, which is that in New York City in the late 90s to the early 2000s, you had the Bloomberg administration who had this policy, the New York City Police Department had this policy of stopping and frisking young Black, teenagers, more so, at a really high rate. A colleague and a board member of mine, Greg Walker, actually wrote about this at the time, courageously. Mm-hmm. So you can see pockets, you can see instances, but let me just say, RA, and we won't spend the rest of our show talking about systemic racism. We got a lot of stuff to talk about with Dave.
No, but I do have a point I'm waiting to make. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for your patience, sir. My partner.
So I think it's important that we maintain an important distinction, which is, and we maintain the linguistic distinction, the precise words, to maintain an important psychological distinction, which is that what I'm hearing from you, David, and what I'm hearing from you, Greg, is, it sounds to me more like there is racism in the system as opposed to systemic racism, by which I mean that if we're talking about implicit bias or pockets of racism that are part of an ingrained culture, that's racism in the system. And I think you'd have to be a fool to assume that doesn't exist, because human beings are human beings and America is America. We all know the past. Systemic racism is something different. Systemic racism is this feeling, and I think at bottom it's a feeling that there's something oppressive in reality. It's baked in. There's nothing I can do about it. Everything is stacked against me, and that both is a reflection of and in turn reinforces a deeply felt resentment. So I do think that we have to keep these two things distinct.
Yeah, I make the distinction a little differently. I say there's a distinction between saying that America is systemically racist versus saying that there's systemic racism in America. That's the distinction that I set forth, because I agree with you that, I don't think that there's anything particularly systemically racist about America. Certainly there was in, 1776 and up until the Civil War and afterwards, and Jim Crow. I think you could argue that it was really deeply baked into the system. At some point, I think you have to say, look, there's still remnants of that, but it's not the way it was before. So I think it's important. No. But I still think that the language is useful because it's a lens. It's about seeing a system rather than just seeing the individual with prejudice. And I think that's a useful contribution from the critical social justice discourse that I can then adopt, but I just don't have to adopt it as a one-size-fits-all explanation for everything.
See, what's really great about what you just did and said, David, is that there are people who, some may be watching this show, or there are people, I know you've been accused of this, whenever you push back against a left or progressive orthodoxy, because we live in a society that has these political binaries, left, right, conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican, that if you're pushing back up against that, that means that you must be conservative, Republican, etc. Okay? Now, that's your business, whether you are or not. But in terms of how you've described yourself and what I know about you, you still consider yourself, well, you said moderate.
Moderate, center left, maybe.
Right, center left. Okay, that's kind of how John McWhorter describes himself. Yeah. But there are people who automatically, if you're pushing back against that, you must be on the right. And what you just said is something that folks on the right, I think, generally speaking, wouldn't say, is that you do find some credence in it. Now, regarding Aryeh, regarding what you said, I think that those who define, from the critical social justice perspective, systemic racism, they would say that your definition was too psychological. They are literally talking about social, economic, systems. It's not just about the individual and what they think.
I understand.
Okay. No, I just want to.
Yeah,
I mean, because one of the things about this,
it's a pantheistic. It's a pantheistic theology. It's a pantheistic Gnostic theology, which embeds itself everywhere.
Okay, all right. Now to continue with David. Now that was a good riff that we went on.
Yeah, we did.
You know?
We did.
Yeah.
Well, you would ask me about the thesis of my book, Woke Anti-Semitism.
Yes.
And I would say that, look, in this discourse that we're talking about, when you divide up the world neatly, as it does, into oppressed and oppressors, and it tends to conflate group success with oppression. In other words, if you take Ibram X. Kendi seriously, and many do, that the only reason why there's any disparity is because of discrimination or oppression, that means that the groups that come up above the mean must be complicit, at the very least, in that oppression. And I think that that's very dangerous. And I think that that's being implicitly adopted by many people here. That's why it's so hard for a university president to push back against anti-Semitism in the same way that they would racism, or to see them even on equal footing, because they've bought into this ideology, at least implicitly. Now, also this idea that Jews are white and that Jews must adopt that identity for themselves, for example.
So what's wrong with that? I mean, there's some people say, clearly, I mean, if race is based on skin color, and folks who are Jewish, particularly Ashkenazi Jews, are colored that way and now check this out. This is me trying to, make an argument for it. Let me just state it. Mm-hmm. I think it's a horrible idea, but let me try to make the case.
Well, give us the strongest argument, please.
The strongest argument would be that if race is based on skin color, and many Jews, if not most Jews in America, have the same skin color as, say, WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, this is key, and can pass.
Yes.
Passing is something that in the Black American tradition, and of course, they have probably names for it in other traditions, but if you have someone who, by virtue of being very light-skinned, could be so light, damn near white, that they could pass for white, and some did because it was the social, economic, and political pressure and oppression was so powerful that some actually chose to do that. That why wouldn't the phenomenon of changing your names, to anglicize your names and that kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
So I don't know if that's the best argument.
I thought you did it. I thought you steel manned it. I thought that was a really good steel man. Look, I think that, part of it is I reject the underlying claim that one's race automatically confers one either privilege or oppression. Again, it can, but doesn't always. Number two, when you insist that Jews must own their whiteness or whatever, you're basically imposing a pseudo identity on them. You're saying you can't identify in your own way. According to 23andMe, I'm 50.4% Western Asian because my mom is from Baghdad, Iraq. My dad is Ashkenazi. I guess I can make a legit claim, and maybe I even have the, I have the ethnic look to justify it, to not being completely white. But I think that that's a very flawed discourse. I think it's unfair to impose identities on people. Let people just define themselves. That's what we do with everybody else. And I think, so when I'm asked, when there's a segment of the Jewish community who says, well, just say that there are Jews who are Black and Jews who are Latino and Jews that are Asian. And that's what they want to say. And so don't overgeneralize. Of course, There are white Jews too. I just say, don't say that. I say, reject the framing, much like you do, I think, Greg, reject the framing altogether, that's not effective framing for society. I don't and I always tell people, don't check the box. I don't check the box. You can check the box if you want, but I no longer check the box, the white box, the Asian box, even the Middle East box. I just don't check it anymore.
David, what was that sentence that you said that people say to Jews, you must own your what?
Own
what
your whiteness.
I'm waiting for someone to say that to me at some point in my life. I would be.
Well, you got to move here, Ari, and I can arrange it very easily.
Oh, good.
But but from a Jewish perspective, I think as Jews, we have to have the inner strength and, conviction to know that language is completely foreign to the way Jews have defined ourselves throughout entire history. You don't find in any Jewish texts going back 3,000 years that we divide between white Jews, brown Jews, black Jews. We have communities. We have cultures. That's never the way we viewed ourselves.
And imagine if you're a Jew from the former Soviet Union who your whole life have been racialized in a way and been treated as an othered. And then you come to this country and now you're told that you must own your whiteness because you appear white to these people. I mean, it's alienating,
it's so interesting because, I went to an event, Jewel and I attended an event called Black Stars. They honored 30 folks racialized as Black, from different ethnic and cultural communities, backgrounds, not just Black Americans, but folks from Africa, the West Indies. And there was a woman who is a executive at Morgan Stanley or JP Morgan Chase, one of the two. And she's African. And she says she only found out she was Black once she moved to the United States.
Right. Exactly. Because we've adopted this sort of, racial system and it's been imposed on people whether they like it or not. I thought Coleman Hughes had a very good way of describing this. He was on Sam Harris's podcast. He just came out with his new book. And he said, we can aspire to be colorblind without being culture blind.
That's a really good, turn of phrase from Coleman, who was our very first guest on Straight Ahead.
And a good one at that. One at that.
In your book, David, you had a very interesting, thought-provoking sentence about woke ideology being post-colonialism imported into the domestic scene. But Greg, maybe do you want to explore a little bit of ethnic studies before we get there? The story of ethnic studies in the United States.
I appreciate that, and I would like to pursue the ethnic studies piece in the United States, because once you talk about post-colonialism, then you're talking about the diaspora, and you're talking about colonization, which is fine, but want to stay here first and then expand that. So I appreciate you.
But for sure. But even when we do that, what David is what's interesting in his claim is that woke ideology is post-colonialism adapted to the United States.
Okay. So yes, David, because I know ethnic studies, as we alluded to earlier, is really a key. What's the deal with ethnic studies? I mean, if you look at it on its face, when I was at Hamilton College from 81 to 85, there was ethnic studies. You had Asian American studies, you had Latin American studies. That was considered ethnic studies, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I used that, colleagues of our fellow classmates and I used having ethnic studies in the curriculum as a way to argue that you need African American studies. What are you doing here? You know what I mean? Sure. It's been around for over 10 years, but you don't have it here. And we actually won that. So what's the deal with ethnic studies?
Yeah, so in the late 1960s, a group of very radical students were pushing universities, and particularly the San Francisco State University, to adopt this ethnic studies, what they called ethnic studies. I think
that's the very first place that actually had a Black studies program, San Francisco State.
I believe so. And under the rubric of ethnic studies, you had Black studies. Now, as Henry Louis Gates III will tell you, not all Black studies is equal. And he would say that at Harvard, we have a highly scholarly discipline in Black studies. And he's actually criticized many university programs as being really more political activism than scholarship. I think in general, what you're seeing in a lot of these universities is what sometimes is referred to now as grievance studies more generally, is not very scholarly. It's more political activism. It'd be very hard to be a student in one of these programs and say, I don't buy the whole post-colonial thing, or I don't buy the whole critical social justice thing. You'd probably be pushed out of the program and fail very quickly and silenced by the professor because you're not in a normal scholarly discipline. And I think
by the way, I do, excuse me for interrupting you, but I do want to say, I want to put a pin in that, because what you're saying is very true, not just in terms of now, but in the mid-90s, I had a Village Voice cover story called The Black Studies War, Multiculturalism versus Afrocentricity, where I basically pitted Henry Louis Gates versus Molefi Asante of Temple University, who was a proponent of Afrocentricity. So these have been going on for a long time, these trends you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. They have been. And I think that they've caught up with us. This has been in the university system. And if you were, the average American, or even, the average normie Democrat or Republican, you probably didn't pay much attention to this because it was something in these, far-flung places in the academy that everybody thought was, not influential in any sense. And I think what we start to see is that actually what became very influential over time, and it sort of jumped the lab into the broader society. So it might have started with what first was called diversity training in the 1980s, where you start to see it in corporations. And it wasn't just about, representation, although that was needed too. Like, I would have been okay with a certain kind of DEI, but it very rapidly morphed from a prescriptive framework to an explanatory framework. In other words, it wasn't just about making sure that there were Black people or women in the leadership ranks, or that you had an inclusive culture that made sure people felt at home in their own companies and organizations. It became an explanation for why there's disparity and who has privilege and who doesn't. It was smuggled into the DEI framework very early on. And that's what I even experienced in the late 1990s with my first brush up with DEI. It wasn't called DEI then. And I think that that just gained momentum. And there's certain pivot points in this, like 2013, 2014, the Black Lives Matter movement, Ferguson protests. Also, apparently, the social media channel Tumblr had a huge effect on the discourse, and it really popularized this ideology and into a sort of a larger force. Now, still, the most radical version of this was ethnic studies or post-colonial studies that was still confined to the university, and it's still easy to ignore, even if there was a direct relationship between it and what had followed, the forms of it that had emerged in the larger society. But with the George Floyd moment, racial reckoning after 2020, all of a sudden, the state of California wants to take ethnic studies out of the university and put it in K through 12 education. Now, what is ethnic studies? You might think it's just studying about other ethnic communities. If it was, I mean, who would take issue with that? I want to know, who my neighbors are, my Asian American neighbors, my Latino neighbors, where they come from, what are their cultures, what are their stories and histories. But that's not what it was. It's actually built on something called a critical consciousness. And it's this idea that, we should be able to recognize and resist systems of oppression. So it's an explanatory framework, not just a descriptive, not just a descriptive framework of how various communities live. And it was adopted in a less radical form than it was originally proposed. The original versions of this were just what I would call batshit crazy. They were anti-Semitic. They specifically named Israel. They treated American Jewish organizations as functions of white supremacy. It was really bad. So the Jewish community fought it at that time and got them to remove the really explicit anti-Semitic variants of this, but left in the fundamental ideological framework as sort of their price of admission. I mean, it's how if you wanted to have influence on it, you sort of had to accept it. I thought that was a mistake at the time. And I think we're still living that down, because I don't think we should accept the idea that post-colonialist ideology should be taught in schools. And I think that's what's happening now, and it's spreading. Even, if a state hasn't adopted it wholesale like California did, it's teachers in social studies in other states and other places are being trained in this pedagogy. And I think that's the problem with this, is that it is spreading into other K through 12 settings. It's being adopted in places like Massachusetts and Minnesota. You see it in New York now. And I think it's a real and present danger to American society, but also particularly to the Jewish community.
So in this context, via ethnic studies, via DEI, through these different tunnels of transmission, post-colonialism is smuggled into the American intellectual, spiritual atmosphere. In other ways as well. Well, let me correct that. It was already in the intellectual, spiritual atmosphere. In this way, it's introduced into the university setting and to other educational settings.
Yes, and to other institutional settings and nonprofit life and government and even the military, by the way, you see, DEI taught in sometimes a very ideological way. And to the Jewish community, by the way, there's the Reform Rabbis DEI program taught rabbis, and it's this language that they use to disrupt daily acts of whiteness. To me, that's highly problematic. Right.
It would be helpful if we just get down to the baseline. Okay, what does that mean if we're going to translate? We're going to culturally translate. We're going to translate the codes. We're going to translate post-colonial thought into an American context. What does that mean at the most basic level?
It buys into this critique that America today is a pervasively racist, corrupt, illegitimate country that is a settler colonial state. So in other words, it shouldn't exist as America. It should be returned to its indigenous populations in some way. It buys into the language of decolonialism. Now, you could say, okay, what is decolonialism? Isn't it just mean that, that former colonies or a colonial power should cease colonizing people? Well, it's this idea that form of colonization and imperialism continue to exist in Western life today. So, for example, if you speak of decolonizing social work, and if you go to Columbia University social work program, that's what you're taught. It changes. It says we have to decolonize our own field, so we stop telling our clients to adapt to the current system we have in place, but rather to teach our clients to recognize and resist systems of oppression in their lives. So it's trying to turn their clients into political activists, and only through liberating them, only through this liberatory framework, can we actually solve their problems, which are systemic in nature, not psychological, not social. They're just victims of oppression. That's what we're teaching them in a fundamental way. So you see this in psychology. You can decolonize psychology. A friend of mine was in a seminar where they were told to decolonize data in their human service field, and and instead embrace indigenous ways of knowing and how they do their data. Again, this is now you could say again, it's crazy, it's quackery. But the problem is that it's gained ground in important places. And even if not everybody embraces the most extreme forms of it, you still see that oppressor-oppressed framework has gained tremendous stature, and it's very hard to push back against.
Well, you mentioned October 7th, and it's clear post-October 7th, the prevalence of the oppressor-oppressed dynamic, as related to Israel and Hamas, or Israel and Palestine, as related to the Jewish community, Jewish American community here, and their role and the tensions thereof based on them being not only Jewish and related then to Israel, but related to them being a successful minority. Therefore, you can't say that they're oppressed, though they have an oppressive history. And like the New York Times had a story on Black-Jewish relationships within the last month and a half or so, at least from the time of this taping. And it was all about the tensions between some Black activists and Jewish activists, all of whom, it was primarily focusing on folks who were
far left,
pro-Palestinian, even pro-Hamas. Okay.
Yes.
and so how even in that framework that they agree on so much, the tensions are there because of the status of Jewish Americans. So can you reflect a bit on, and we'll bring it back to the post-colonial, more widely, but how October 7th has really shown these fissures and really amplified how these ideologies have become so entrenched, not just in DEI, and I do want to come back to DEI,
sure,
but far beyond that.
Yeah. A lot of Jews who have been part of progressive spaces for their whole lives had a real wake-up call after October 7th. You can speak to a Reform rabbi whose interfaith partners never placed a call or even, refused to take a call. And you hear about progressive activists, and I talk to these people out. I go to mainstream Jewish groups and I speak about the thesis of my book and the like, and I'm expecting sometimes there to be pushback, and occasionally there might be a little bit, but more and more it's progressive Jews who are profoundly alienated, estranged from progressive circles, not knowing where they fit into American society in a fundamental way anymore, and being just out of sorts and not knowing where to go with it. And there's a growing disconnect between these people, the rank and file, I would argue, in the organized Jewish community. You have a lot of mainstream Jewish groups who obviously have had the same wake-up call, and they know that there's a deeper problem on the left than they had previously imagined. And they may, in close circles at least, be willing to say that, yes, this oppressor-oppressed ideology is caught on, and they're labeling us as the oppressors, and all of the above. But they're not willing to go and say, for example, I'm using this just as an example. We don't have to go here yet, but that DEI, the framework of a DEI, is fundamentally problematic. They just are still stuck on trying to get Jews insinuated into the DEI framework so that we get the protections as well. And the reason is, and they know this and they feel it, is that they're fundamentally worried about, if they do go in the direction that I'm advocating, that they will alienate themselves in a basic way from their progressive coalition partners. They're worried that they're going to lose all the social capital that they built over many years with their local NAACP chapter, and they've been told that in a way. Like it's not hard to pick up on when a key figure of a civil rights organization condemns, let's say, a Bill Ackman for questioning DEI. The Jewish organization says, "Oh, I don't want that fate myself," so they end up reverting back to how they did business before October 7th. And I think that's what we're seeing. But I will say I've been stunned at how deeply this has sunk into sort of the rank and file Jewish community. I think a lot of people are experiencing a kind of political, social, intellectual crisis as a result of this, and they just don't know where they fit in.
Wow. Well,
there's definitely been a psychic upheaval.
Yes.
You can feel that. I think we can also agree, David, that the American Jewish community, as diverse as it is in its different manifestations, pretty much across the board, the ancient Jewish virtue of courage is not one of the outstanding characteristics of American Jews that we need to reintroduce. And when you're talking about the fear of losing social capital, that's just a failure of courage.
We've at the post 6 Day War, 1967 6 Day War, the American Jewish community became much more successful politically, much more assertive politically, and we worked our ways into the halls of power, in Congress and the like. And we became what I would call an incumbent, maybe. We started to see ourselves that way with a lot to lose. And all of a sudden, we start to get routed in, the K through 12 system, in the university system, and where we're not strong, where we have very little social capital, where whatever social capital we have or political capital we have in Congress or in the halls of power doesn't translate at all. And yet we still behave like we're the incumbent, when we need to start looking at ourselves, I would argue, more as the insurgent. I'll give you a good example of this. A small school district in Southern California adopts a very radical anti-Israel ethnic studies curriculum. And the anti-Israel forces come to the school board meeting in full force with all their anti-Zionist signs and their chants and the like. And the Jewish organized community there makes a strategic decision to not do that themselves because they don't want to risk a clash. And instead, they bring 4 well-rehearsed people to give testimony. Now, was that more effective from a political standpoint? I couldn't tell you, but my gut is that we have to rethink that entire way of interacting with society, that we're projecting a kind of weakness when we do that, and that we have to start behaving more like an insurgent, more like our adversaries do, in order to have social capital in the places that we've lost it. And that requires courage, by the way.
No, yeah.
And breaking with your past, which I think is very hard for people to do. American Jews have become accustomed to seeing what I'll call the Cossacks, the anti-Semites on the right. We know who they are. When we hear like an Alex Jones or somebody like that, or a Marjorie Taylor Greene, some alarm goes off in our Jewish psyche. Oh, those are the Cossacks. Those are the bad guys. Yet when leftists bring to the table their utopian ideals, we don't see the Cossack in them. So that's why so many Jews couldn't get with the program on anti-communism for a long time, because they still believed in this sort of universal promise that the communists offered, even after Stalin had murdered millions of people. And I think we have a blind spot. Whatever great survival instincts the Jews have developed, we have a blind spot when it comes to sort of utopianism on the left. And so I think a lot of Jews now realize that they miscalculated, but they don't know what to do with it. And look, to be honest with you, where can they go? I mean, the right is not exactly auspicious either. It's not like we're going to find safe harbor on the sort of populist right either. So my argument to my fellow Jews is let's join the project of rebuilding a center in American society, from the 30-yard line to the 30-yard line, and a sense of identity, an Omni-American identity that I think will provide safe harbor. But it's a generational project. It won't solve our problems tomorrow or next week in your school system. It's going to require us to rethink where we fit in and where we want American society to go.
You need a different metaphor, because we need to get in the end zone.
Yes. Well, there might not be an end zone, but at least let's get a first down here and there.
Well, as we round the bend to the conclusion here, I think it's a good place to ask you for your own summation or your own description of what do you think Omni-American is and means, because we keep referring to it. But in your own words, David, what is an Omni-American to you?
I always love the phrase, since I was a kid, e pluribus unum, from many come one. And I love the fact that I have a diverse background. I love the fact that on some basic level, I can relate to a Latino person who was brought up in Texas and have something in common with them. Even though our life experience is different in many ways, because there's something about being an American and what America stands for. And I think that's what we have to embrace. That's to me what an Omni-American means. I think the phrase antagonistic cooperation comes to mind.
You bring that in your book?
I do. I love that model, that idea that we have to allow that back in our discourse. Occasionally it'll be antagonistic and a little less cooperative, but ultimately, I think we've got to allow that in our discourse and in the way that we go through life and the way that we interact with other people. I think that's the best humanity can do right now. And I don't think that the discourse we're seeing on the far left any more than the far right is going to get us further along than that notion. And that's why I so admire what you guys are doing and how you brought that into the discourse and have given it programmatic form. I think it's so necessary. And, I'm honored to be part of it in any way I can.
David,
thank you so much.
We really appreciate you saying that. And we appreciate you joining us today.
And everyone should view
and listen to your own podcast.
The Contrarian podcast, yes. If I can say one word,
yes.
I'm going to spend the first dozen or so episodes on what's wrong with higher education and what to do about it. And my thesis, by the way, is that, the Jewish community wants sort of immediate amelioration of the problems on campus. And yeah, sometimes we can get it, but we're going to have to deal with the much deeper structural issues. I look at it like the iceberg, right? The iceberg metaphor, where part of the iceberg is above the waterline. That's the anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism that students are experiencing, that we're seeing. But below the waterline, the bummock of the iceberg, I learned that term, there's this deep reality of ideology. And if we're not fighting it below the waterline, I'm afraid we're not going to be able to make long-term change.
I'm sure it's going to be a fascinating and informative series of discussions. I look forward to listening to them.
Me too.
Thank you. Well, I hope maybe you guys will participate in one.
Hey, just invite us.
We'll do.
Okay. All right. Well, David Bernstein, thank you for joining us here on Straight Ahead, the Omni-American podcast.
Great to be with you guys.
But one of the things I did want to talk to you about was DEI, that there are all kinds of DEIs. We know the kind institutionally that is really problematic and that has a real strong, force going in this direction. And there's been a pushback against that. But in the corporate arena, and other places, there are different forms of it,
Yes.
So I think that has to be acknowledged, that it's not all the same and it's not all the bad form.
Yeah, I try to do that, and it's sometimes hard to tell. What DEI programs sometimes do is they present themselves as a form of representation. And you say, okay, I'm on board with that. And then they sort of smuggle into either the curriculum or into the training this more radical oppressed framework. And you don't really know what you're getting when you sign up for it. And sometimes they're explicit about the representational idea and surreptitious about the ideological connotations.
Yeah.
And so but I agree. I've seen examples of inclusive pluralistic DEI. Danielle Allen, who Omni-American Project honored, and she was fantastic, and I took note of her, wrote an amazing piece in the Washington Post recently about how she had chaired a 2018 task force to change DEI at Harvard. And I later learned, by the way, that she was a runner-up for the president of Harvard University. I didn't know that, against Claudine Gay.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah.
The fact that they chose Claudine Gay over Danielle Allen is one of the most damning things that I have heard, and I've heard a whole lot of damning things. And on my own blog, I condemned Claudine Gay and basically said that I thought that karma's a bitch, and based on what she did to Roland Fryer, alone, gave her a reason to.
Exactly. Danielle Allen writes this piece. She was part of a 4-person task force in 2018 trying to get an inclusive, pluralistic form of DEI that included viewpoint diversity and religious diversity into the mix, which would have transformed DEI if you take it seriously. Come the George Floyd moment, they scrapped it, even though they had officially accepted it, for the more radical form of DEI. What I worry about, Greg, and this is particularly in higher education, is that once these bureaucracies latch on to DEI, they're almost exclusively promoting the more radical forms of anti-racism, Kendi style and Robin DiAngelo style. And it's going to be very hard to get a more pluralistic form. I have more hope in the corporate sector, where I agree with you, you're seeing more pluralistic DEI in certain places. Some places, by the way, they adopt the more radical version. They bring in the wrong kind of consultants and, make a mess of things.
But corporations are so bottom line oriented.
Yeah.
That first of all, some of them do it for PR reasons.
Yes. Or legal reasons. Sometimes
legal reasons. But after a while, if it ain't working, they can quietly just, get rid of it or not support it, or just let it be in name only. There's all kind of ways that corporations have to deal with it. But anyway,
I have an article, if you want to include it on your show notes, it's on DEI and the Jews. It's like a 4,000 word essay I just wrote a couple weeks ago. So
where is it going to be published?
It was in the Jewish Journal. It was a cover story of the Jewish Journal about 2-3 weeks ago.
That.
So
I saw that.
I probably sent it to you. Yeah. So
probably no. Send it. Send it again, okay, so we can put it in show notes. Yeah,
I will. Sounds good.
All right.
Okay. Be well, guys.
Okay,
see you later.
Thank you for watching us on Straight Ahead, the Omni-American podcast.
Subscribe today and fight for a future in which the many join as one against bigotry.